We don't chase trends, we on the wave. Lagos to the world, we build, we brave, we build, we brave, we build, we brave, we build. Continent DNA.
There is this old piece of advice that has been around forever. It goes like this: whatever you do, ask for wisdom and ask for vision. Most people hear that, they nod, and it ends up on a wall somewhere as a nice quote. That is it. But every once in a while, somebody actually builds it with their hands and turns it into steel and concrete, a thing you can walk up to and stand next to. If you want to see what that looks like, look at the Dangote refinery. Building that refinery is not really a business story. I mean, sure, it is, but that is not the part that matters. It is a lesson. If you are a founder anywhere on this earth, you should know its code. And if you love solving problems, you should understand what actually happened out there. Because here is where most people get it wrong. They respect it for the money, the billions, the scale, and how big it is. But that was never the reason. The reason is what he was trying to do. He wasn't building a factory, he was taking on a whole system, a system built on waste, and a system that a lot of very powerful people were perfectly happy to live exactly the way it was. Why would they touch it? It worked for them. And this is the main thing I really want you to understand. Aliko Dangote has more money than anyone else in the whole of Africa, and he still ran into massive walls. He still had to fight people who absolutely did not want this big factory to exist. If the wealthiest man on the continent could not get an easy part, then none of us are going to get a free pass either. And that right there is the whole point of the story. I am Toby Duru. Welcome to Continent DNA, the show about great opportunities in Africa, the DNA of markets, and the playbook to thrive in them. Let me give you a number, and it is a number that should not make sense. Nigeria is sitting on about 37 billion barrels of proven oil. It is one of the most oil-rich countries on the entire planet. And yet, for decades, more than 8 out of every 10 liters of fuel that Nigerians were putting in their cars came from somewhere else. It was imported. The oil leaves the country as a thick black mud. It goes on a big ship to somewhere very far away to be cleaned and turned into car fuel. And then it comes right back to Nigeria with a much higher price tag on it. So you have a country that is basically sitting on top of an ocean of oil, but it still has to buy the actual fuel its people need from total strangers across the sea. And here is the strange part. For decades, everybody just accepted it, not as a problem to go fix, but they accepted it the way you accept the weather. You don't argue with rain, you just grab an umbrella. Nigeria pumps the oil, somebody else refines it. That is just how it was, and that is how it has always been. Until one guy looked at that whole arrangement and refused to accept it. This is the story of what it cost to answer one question. Not in a speech or in some policy paper, but in concrete, in steel, and in $20 billion. One man betting his entire fortune, all of it, on a single idea that you could take the engine sitting underneath a modern economy and just build it yourself from the swamp up, literally from nothing. And to get how he pulled that off and what it took out of him, we have got to go back to a teenager, back to a loan from his uncle, and back to a whole life spent learning one business at a time exactly how to do the impossible thing that he did not even know yet he was going to do. Aliko Dangote was born April 10th, 1957 in Kano. You have got to understand what Kano is. It is the old commercial capital of northern Nigeria. For 1,000 years, this was the finish line, the place where the massive caravans of merchants and camels ended up after crossing the Sahara. These were trade routes through the desert long before there was ever a country called Nigeria on a map. And he was not born into just any family. He was born into the Dan Tatars. They are a Hausa Muslim trading family and one of the most powerful commercial dynasties in the whole history of West Africa. His name, which his grandfather gave him, actually means the victorious one who defends humanity. Aliko's maternal great grandfather, Al Hassan Dantata, was the one who started it all. To truly understand how the Dangote Empire became possible, you have to realize that the family money did not just come from a standard bank account or a quiet inheritance. It was forged in pure, raw physical survival. Decades before Aliko Dangote was even born, his maternal great grandfather lived a life that sounds more like an epic movie than a business biography. The history books love to talk about him as this legendary patriarch of West African wealth. But what people usually leave out is that when he was just a teenager, he lost everything. He got caught in the middle of a bloody civil war and was literally sold into slavery. Al Hassan was born in 1877 into a highly respected merchant clan called the Agalawa. His parents were incredibly powerful caravan leaders who made massive fortunes trading textiles, cattle, and kola nuts all over West Africa. They operated out of a heavily fortified market town called Bebich, right south of Kano. On paper, this kid had won the genetic lottery, but when he was only 8 years old, his father died. His mother ended up moving all the way down to Ghana to run her own independent trading business, leaving Al Hassan and his siblings behind in Bibich. This is the exact moment his legendary family name was born. Because his mother had to travel for weeks across the continent, she left the children in the care of an old family slave woman named Tata. Tata essentially became his foster mother, raising him through his childhood. In the Hausa language, the prefix Dan means son of. So the local community in Bebeji began calling the young boy Al Hassan Dantata, literally meaning Al Hassan, the son of Tata. What started as a schoolyard nickname, identifying a boy raised by an old caretaker, eventually transformed into the ultimate corporate family brand in Nigeria. Right after his mother left, the family business completely fell apart because people managed the money poorly and the relatives started fighting over everything. Al Hassan lost every single bit of the money his father had left for him. It all just vanished. Think about how crazy that is. One day you are the child of a wealthy family, and the next day you are a young teenager doing any odd job you can find and literally begging food just to survive while going to school. Al Hassan had to start completely from nothing. He began by scraping together whatever tiny bits of money he could find just to buy small goods to sell in the local market. Slowly, he used those few coins to get back on his feet and got back into the trading business. But just as he was starting to make a little progress, a big war broke out in the region and everything blew up. In 1893, the Emir of Kano died and the Sultan of Sokoto stepped in to appoint a highly unpopular successor, completely bypassing the local choice. This triggered a brutal scorched earth conflict called the Kano Civil War. Al Hassan's clan backed the wrong side. When the rebels attacked the area, they went straight into his hometown of Bebeji, stole everything they could find, and burned all the houses and shops to the ground. The rebel faction won the war, and merchants on the winning side began rounding up the survivors. Al Hassan and his brothers were captured, stripped of what little money they had left, and sold into physical slavery. This is where the story should have ended, but his legendary rebuild started almost immediately. Within a short time of being captured, Al Hassan managed to either escape or buy back his freedom. He walked away from that nightmare with absolute zero money. His hometown was in ashes, his inheritance was gone, and the new political administration ruling Kano viewed his entire family as enemies of the state. So he fell back on the only thing nobody could steal from him, his internal trading playbook. He then joined the long distance Gold Coast traveling merchant groups, learning exactly how to run the tricky but highly profitable trade routes between Nigeria and Ghana. He simply outworked and outmaneuvered everyone else on the trails. By the time British colonial forces marched into Kano a decade later and stabilized the trade routes, Al Hassan had accumulated a massive pool of private capital. He marched right back into Kano, used his liquidity to successfully reclaim his father's seized properties through the court, and leveraged his cash to become the exclusive buying agent for massive European merchant firms like the Royal Niger Company. In 1929, the Bank of British West Africa opens a branch in Kano, and Al Hassan walks in as its first customer. By the 1940s, Al Hassan had transformed himself from a boy who was once begging for food and locked in chains into the single wealthiest individual in West Africa. When Al Hassan died in 1955, just 2 years before Aliko Dangote was born, that massive fortune did not just sit idle in a bank. It was spread across the entire family system, a system that was basically funding the early banking sector across northern Nigeria. And the commercial gene did not skip a generation. Al Hassan's son, Sanusi, became a major trader in his own right, moving massive volumes of granites and building materials across the region. Sanusi had a daughter named Maria, who is Aliko Dangote's mother. Aliko's father, Mohammed Dangote, ran a successful transport business and worked closely with Sanusi on the logistics side. And then early tragedy struck the family again. When Aliko was only about 8 years old, his father died suddenly, throwing the whole house into chaos just as Aliko was starting to learn the family trade. Because of a deep tradition in their culture where the grandparents step in to raise the first grandchild, Aliko moved into the home of his grandfather Sanusi. He spent the rest of his childhood growing up under that roof, learning everything from the old man. And what that means is his whole everyday childhood was basically a masterclass in money, currency, and supply chain. There is this great story from his primary school days in Kano that perfectly captures it. Most rich kids buy sweets just to eat them, right? That is the whole transaction. You buy the candy, you eat it, and you are done. At just 8 years old, Aliko took his pocket money to the wholesale markets his family controlled and bought cartons of sweets in bulk. Instead of hawking them himself, he hired his classmates to sell those sweets all across the schoolyard at recess, giving them a small cut while he pocketed the rest of the profit. Where every other kid saw a carton of candy, he saw a margin. Where they saw a playground, he saw a market. At 8 years old, he is already running the entire playbook of his adult life. Find a captive market, lock in a supply chain advantage that nobody can touch, control the distribution, and let other people work the retail counter while you sit back and collect the cash. There is a straight line from that little boy selling sweets at recess to the man who builds the single largest refinery on the face of the planet. The size of the bed changed enormously, but the behavior never changed. Before heading to Cairo for university, Aliko runs through this whole string of northern schools, including a madrasa, which is basically a traditional Islamic school where you study religious texts and Arabic before moving on to a regular high school in Kano and then secondary school over at Government College Benin Kudu in Jigawa State in northern Nigeria. From there, he heads to Egypt to study business at Al Azhar University, which is one of the oldest Islamic universities in the world. In 1977, he comes back home to Nigeria. He is 20 years old, and that same year, he marries his first wife, Zinab, in a traditional arranged marriage. Right around that time, he goes to his family for money, and that loan became the foundation of his business. Back then, Nigeria was changing fast because the 1973 oil shock had just stuffed the government's pockets full of petrodollars. Lagos is turning into one giant construction site with cranes everywhere. The catch is that Nigeria barely manufactures anything. Every single bag of cement, every grain of sugar, and every kilo of rice have to come in across the sea. The absolute hunger for cement in Nigeria had already caused total chaos, culminating in what became known as the cement armada. The government approved the import of 16 million tons of cement all at once, creating a massive bottleneck that left hundreds of ships stranded off the coast of Lagos for months. The congestion became so severe that the state was forced to pay millions a demurrage, effectively compensating importers for the time their ships sat idle at sea. It was a total disaster. But where everybody else look at that mess, Dangote looks at an opening. He goes to his family and asks for a loan to go chase a gap in the market. So they front him 500,000 naira loan in 1977. In the local commodity markets back then, the buying power of that amount was absolutely huge. But the family attached a really brutal condition to it. This was not a gift. This was a serious loan, and if he failed, he would not just lose the money, he would completely destroy his reputation inside the entire family network. Those were the stakes. But Dangote did not take years to figure it out. He managed to secure one of those highly sought after import licenses and jumped straight into the cement trade. Right from day one, he started building up his own logistics fleet of delivering trucks to control the distribution. And according to his own account of the story, he actually managed to pay back the entire loan in just 90 days. So, how exactly does a 20 years old pay back that kind of money in just 3 months? Most just assumed he worked hard and hustled, and sure he did, no doubt about that. But that is not the real answer. The answer is this little piece of financial engineering called the trade credit float. Back in 1977, Nigeria is booming on oil money and everybody needs cement. Dangote does not just sell it, he pulls off a genius move. He buys the cement on credit from his foreign suppliers and they give him months to pay them back. But his own trucks are clearing those ships and selling the cargo for hard cash almost immediately. The cash is landing right in his pocket long before the supplier's bill ever comes due. So he is sitting on this growing pool of cash, and it is entirely other people's money, interest free for that matter. He just pours it straight back into the business, buying more trucks and ordering more shipments. He is basically operating like a bank before he ever owns a single factory. And that speed became the whole engine the entire business runs on. If he buys whole shiploads at a time, like Thai rice, Brazilian sugar, or European cement, he can handle the shipping costs and still sell for less than any local trader in Lagos or Kano. He can undercut all of them. So he parks his truck right there at the port's gates. The second a ship docks, the goods come off, go straight onto his truck, and head straight to the wholesale hubs. He controls both end, the product and where it goes. So by 1981, he makes it official and sets up Dangote Nigeria Limited and Blue Star Services. What started with just cement begins to spread into rice, fish, sugar, salt, flour, and textiles. For about 20 years, from 1977 all the way to the late 90s, the Dangote Group is basically one thing, a high volume middleman moving imported goods. That is the whole business. But it was not a smooth ride up. In the mid 80s, the military government starts messing around with the foreign currency allocation. Suddenly, Dangote can't get the credit he needs to pay for his shipments. The whole thing he built, that entire trade credit float, depends completely on that access, and now it is gone. He has perishable sugar sitting out there at sea and no hard currency to clear it. The clock is ticking and there is absolutely nothing he can do. He is forced to approach international traders from a position of weakness, sacrificing significant margin just to prevent a default. A default would have wrecked the family name, which was the one thing he was told on day one never to touch. In those moments, he learns a lesson that he never forgets. A pure importer is always at the mercy of the central bank. If they decide not to give you dollars, you are done. It does not matter how good you are or how fast your trucks are. Somebody else is holding the switch. You can almost feel the next 20 years of his life starting to take shape in that one realization. It is the 1990s, and you are one of the biggest cement importers in all of Nigeria. You make money every single time a ship full of foreign cement pulls into a Nigerian port. Your whole business runs entirely on importing. But then you start thinking about building factories inside Nigeria. That sounds completely insane. It is a crazy idea because think about what a cement plant costs. It takes hundreds of millions of dollars upfront, and that money goes straight into the ground. It takes years to come back to you, if it even comes back at all. Plus, this is Nigeria we are talking about, with unreliable power, bad roads, and a wobbling currency. A reputation that scared investors right off. You would be running toward the fire everyone else built their whole business to avoid. Those infrastructure deficits, the grid failures, the broken logistics networks, the currency volatility, they were the exact structural barriers that forced everyone else to rely on imports. Every other big player is perfectly just happy importing. Why wouldn't they be? The import system itself had powerful friends, people who would feel threatened the second somebody tried to change it. So that is the pressure Dangote was facing. Everything was telling him not to do it. The turning point comes after he spent some time in Atlanta in the US in the late 90s. Something about that trip settles a deep conviction in him. It is simple. He is going to stop importing things and he is going to start making them. That one decision changes his company and it changes Nigeria as well. The safe move was obvious: keep importing, stay rich, and keep it easy. But he took the hard road instead because he understood one thing that all the other importers refused to see. Importing is just a position, it is not a real business. There is a huge difference. An importer owns nothing that lasts, just a relationship with some foreign factory and a license. That is the whole thing. So the day the rules change or the currency moves or somebody else undercuts him, he is completely exposed. He has nothing underneath him. The real world, the kind that nobody can ever take away from you, sits with whoever owns the factory, the person who takes the raw material and turns it into the finished product. That is where the real power is. So Dangote goes and does the exact thing everyone called crazy. He goes from being the biggest importer in the country to being the biggest manufacturer. It wasn't a clean climb at all for Dangote. All through the 90s and the early 2000s, he tried a bunch of businesses that just flat out did not work. He went into textiles, tomato processing, flour milling, and he even tried running an airline. One after another, they got absolutely hammered. cheap imports came flooding in, foreign currency dried up, costs ran high, and the infrastructure was just bad. On top of that, the rules kept shifting under his feet. The tomato factory reportedly ran just for a few months and then shut down. The airline basically drowned in regulation, and the textile business just could not survive the massive wave of cheap Asian imports rolling into the Nigerian market. These weren't small stumbles either. They cost him real time, real money, and serious image. But here is the big difference between him and most people. He did not treat them like failures. He treated them like tuition. They were just expensive lessons. Every single one of those lessons sharpened one specific rule in his head: make locally what the country is already importing and only go into sectors where Nigeria had steady demand and a real cost advantage. That became the filter everything had to pass through from then on. So in 1999, democracy comes back to Nigeria and Olusegun Obasanjo gets elected president. One of the first things Obasanjo does is open up the books, and he sees a country bleeding billions on basic imports, on stuff Nigeria should just be making itself. Early in 2000, Dangote and his team fly to Brazil to study how a real manufacturing economy actually works. When he comes back, he walks straight into Aso Rock, which is where the president of Nigeria lives, with a deal. The pitch is simple: ban the import of bagged cement, give tax breaks to companies that build factories at home, and in return, he will stop importing and build the biggest plants on the continent. That deal turns into the backward integration policy. The rule is you can only import cement if you are actively putting money into making it locally. It is a masterclass in building a protective wall around your own business. At the macro level, it worked over time. It saved hundreds of millions in foreign currency, pushed Nigeria to completely self sufficiency by 2015, and flipped the country from a major importer into exporter. But we can't tell this as some clean, free market fairy tale. Here is the other side of the ledger. Dangote was one of the biggest funders of Obasanjo's election campaigns, putting millions into two cycles. So the very policy that anchored his fortune was shaped by men who stood to gain from it. Defenders will tell you the policy was open to anyone willing to take a massive risk in a country famous for changing its mind overnight. Critics will counter with sure, but look at who actually had the capital and the access to use it. Both of those things are true at the exact same time. Around 2000, Dangote buys a broken down state owned outfit called the Benue Cement Company in Goboko. Right after that, he takes over a paper company called Obajana Cement in Kogi State. And that is where he builds a brand new mega plant from scratch. This whole cement rollout was the exact blueprint he needed. It taught him how to handle massive project execution before he finally took on the biggest challenge of his life, the refinery. Today, Obajana is the biggest cement factory south of the Sahara, but building it nearly ruined Dangote. Right at the start, local workers blocked the gates because they did not want a businessman from the north taking over a factory they felt belonged to them. Then the actual civil engineering turned into a complete nightmare. The initial soil tests were completely wrong. 3 months after digging started, engineers realized the ground was way harder than expected. They had to halt everything, rewrite the entire design, and smashed 1,000 deep concrete piles into the earth just to hold the structure steady. Because the site was completely remote, he had to build an entire wall around it just to make the factory work, including a 90-kilometer gas pipeline, a dedicated dam, and a worker housing. The commercial banks would only give him short-term money, even though a project of this scale take years to break even. More than once, the entire group was on the edge of insolvency. Dangote later called it one of the hardest times of his life. Building the capacity was only half the battle. Holding the market share was the other half, because three major rivals came at him all at once. The first was Cletus Ibetu, who did the exact opposite of Dangote. Instead of sinking capital into factories, Ibetu just brought in finished cement on huge ships, backed it locally, and undercut everyone on price. When this cheap supply flooded the market, Dangote's margins collapsed, so he complained directly to President Obasanjo. The state stepped in, banned Ibetu's imports, and ordered him to build local factories, while Dangote was allowed to keep clearing his own shipments. Thousands of Ibetu's workers lost their job, and the legal battle dragged on for years. It proved that a major pillar of Dangote's edge wasn't just operational, it was regulatory. The second rival was deeply personal, a direct clash with Abdul Samad Rabiut, the head of Bua Group. This escalated into a brutal, tough war over limestone reserves in Okpala, Edo State. It got so hostile that Rabiu wrote an open letter to the president accusing Dangote of weaponizing federal ministries and local police to shut down Bua's mining. Dangote fired back, claiming Bua was illegally encroaching on his valid list. It was a classic Nigerian corporate siege with competing court injunctions and the state governor halting production to prevent civil unrest. Rabiu represented a totally different breed of competitor for Dangote. Dangote's historical playbook relied on total market dominance and policy alignment to outmuzzle legacy players. Rabiu, however, ran an incredibly lean modern institutional companies by optimizing logistics and targeting underserved regional hubs. Bua Direct challenged Dangote's pricing power. For the first time, Dangote wasn't looking at a disorganized local trader. He was looking at a modernized mirror image of his own ambition. Rabiu built a plant in Sokoto right on top of the limestones and gas supplies, even laying his own gas pipeline to bypass government power failures. Years later, when Rabiu aggressively dropped his cement price, he forced Dangote to do the same. That fight never stopped. The third rival was the biggest of them all, Lafarge, the global multinational that had dominated the Nigerian market for decades. Dangote's answer was pure scale. He built newer, giant modern facilities that completely shifted the cost curve, producing at a volume and cost efficient Lafarge's legacy plants could not match. While Lafarge relied on the unreliable national grid, Dangote built captive power stations inside his facilities. When the lights went out for the competition, Dangote's clings kept running. The economics of that cement business explain how he funded everything else. the margins were massive. He took that cash and scaled across the continent, building in Cameroon, Zambia, Ethiopia, Senegal, and South Africa, eventually operating across 10 countries. By 2023, the cement business alone was generating around $3.5 billion a year. When Dangote finally listed the company on the local stock exchange in Nigeria, the business had a public price tag. He now had a massive liquidity machine throwing off billions in cash. And that pile of cash is exactly what gave him the balance sheet to go out and build the refinery.
We
Keep
on the way.
building.
Lagos to the world. We build, we brave, we build, we brave, we build, we brave, we brave, we build. Continent DNA.